apropos, that's appropriate, to really launch into, before we get into just sport finance, is to establish an understanding of the monetary system of the world, how money flows in and out of personal and organizational and governmental entities, the basis for money and currency and the establishment of wealth and value. And so I go back into the biblical times and I look at a little bit about how God initiated it, how we see it in the Near Eastern culture played out. We'll come forward into more modern and current times. And so these first few lectures, I weave in a little bit more of the personal and professional financial. And then as we go throughout the term, I'll be able to kind of stop and spend some time, because I want you to understand money and value and net worth and the differences between currency and some of those things. So before we had money, what did we have? Well, let's just start with establishing something that's money. So when you have a piece of paper in your wallet, it looks something like this. This is what we call money today. Unfortunately, it's mislabeled. This is actually currency. And this is a Federal Reserve note printed by the Federal Reserve, which is neither federal nor has any reserves. Actually, the Federal Reserve of the United States is owned by 6 international conglomerate banks, and they print the currency and then loan it to the Treasury. The Treasury then uses it and dispenses it accordingly, according to the federal government, into the financial system, which is the banks. And then the banks dispense it to corporations and organizations who hire people like me, and then it gets to me eventually in the form of payroll and other means, and then we utilize it in the marketplace where we transact business and we do pragmatheo, that's the Greek word, we do business. So this piece of paper, although you can classify it as money, in the old days you couldn't ever print money. Printing of money is the fabricating of something of value out of something that has no value. The truth is, this is just a piece of paper. Now, where does paper come from? Does anybody know? Trees. And here in America, we get a great deal of our trees and our paper from Brazil. So this is probably a tree from Brazil, honestly. Now, it's a special kind of paper. It's got special kind of ink on it. It's got some special engraving. It's got the little strip in it. And so there's all kinds of little bells and whistles to make sure we can't counterfeit it. But for the most part, that's a tree. Particulates or particles of a tree that was processed. Now, I don't encourage any of you to go out and start growing your own trees with the hopes of having a money tree in your backyard. That's simply not feasible, nor is it ethical, nor is it legal. So my legal advice is don't even give it consideration. We don't want the thought police to come after you. But before there was this, there had to be some other ways of transacting business in the society of life. And that's where we want to start with. How was it done? How did they do it? And whatever brought us to the point where we now have those pieces of fiat currency kind of put together for us. Okay, now if this one doesn't work, there we go. So we're going to talk about what are known as the concepts of bartering. And if you go back and look through the Bible, both the Old and New Testament, you'll see the establishment of bartering was well entrenched in the public societies and the systems in the peoples of life. The clans, that's the people groups, the clans were well accustomed to bartering 5,000 and 6,000 and 7,000 years ago. Now I'm a young earth individual, so I believe creation would have happened somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago. So when I make reference to, I'm coming from that perspective. I just want you to know that. So the notion of bartering would have been well established in Near Eastern cultures, Sumer, Egypt, China, all throughout the Middle East, where Palestine, and where Jesus was, and the Roman culture before the Roman Empire. And so that's kind of what we're talking about here. The notions of bartering is that we trade items with someone in exchange for an item. And so you can imagine the name itself, bartering. If you've never used that term, I'll probably use it 100 times in the next 2 days, and we'll kind of wane from it a little bit. But simply, anytime we transact business, I want something from you, so I'm willing to give you something that you want. Now, you like these things because you know these things work well in your life, and so you want these things. I want something that you have, and so we make a trade, we make a transaction, we make an exchange. Now, those are interchangeable words. Now, you'll hear me make interchangeable words in business we make a trade, a transaction, or an exchange would all be the same thing. We do business. We do business using stuff that I want with stuff that you want, and we make trades. So you can imagine they didn't have these kinds of things back then. They didn't have printing presses. They couldn't cut down the paper particulates like we have today. So they had to trade things of value in order to acquire things of value. So the concept of bartering, so I'm a little slow. Maybe I'll do it before there was money, people simply traded what they wanted for what they wanted, or what they had for what they needed, that kind of thing. So there were difficulties or problems with that we noticed really early on. You can see it in the biblical narratives, and I'll get to some of them, but it is interesting. Of the many proverbs we're going to look at, there is one proverb that's repeated no less than 5 times in the Proverbs, is that the Lord does not like dishonest weights and measures. Another word would be dishonest scales, are an abomination to the Lord. Now, if you read through the Proverbs, you may see that every couple of chapters. When Solomon repeats that over and over, what do you think he's trying to communicate to us? When the Lord repeats something to you, what do you think's going on?
It's important.
It's important to God, so therefore it should be important to who? All of us, all of the people, the children of God. So, of all the Proverbs, there are some synonymous proverbs: relationships, money, holiness, righteousness, the fool and the wise person. It's interesting. But certainly this proverb, no less than 5 times in there, the Lord does not like dishonest weights and scales. Now, weights and scales was drawn from what? In the Near Eastern culture, when you grew crop, or you had chickens and goats or eggs, or you mined salt, or you found some silver, and you mined iron ore or something, you had really fresh water, you would go to a marketplace. You would go to a bazaar with your stuff. You've seen it in enough movies, lots of people, lots of vendors. But usually at the center of that marketplace was the governing agencies, and they'd have a table or two set up with some scales on it. And they would weigh this product and give you something of that product. And what you were looking for as the trader was some equitable value. If you put down X amount of salt on there, you were looking for X amount of corn or soybean because you were trying to make that trade. That's how they measured. They didn't have units of measurement like you and I have today, so they had to measure based on weight. Well, unfortunately, the unscrupulous ones in society would set the scale so it would weigh one side heavier and one side lighter. It was an unethical way to defraud somebody of their hard-earned, hard-working stuff. You have worked for days, weeks, months to grow corn and soybean and wheat, and you got fresh water out of wells that others don't have, and eggs and chickens. You come to the marketplace, you're ready to make trades, you're ready to do business, because you got to get stuff you need, and then you show up to the table and the guy is ripping you off. This couldn't be any more frustrating, and it's frustrating for God to such a point, as he says it multiple times. It's an abomination, is one time he used, abomination to the Lord to have dishonest weights and measures, to cheat somebody behind the scenes they don't even know it in such a dishonorable way is just, it just really makes the Lord unhappy. And so we can leave it at that. So there were problems with the bartering system, problems that the advancement of a monetary system began to solve. So let's look and understand some of those problems. I can clearly see this. First of all, if all of us grow the same thing, if all of us have the same thing, if all of us brought the same thing, then I simply couldn't find what I needed. And I would have too much of an item, surplus, and I'd have a lot of demand for another item. So if you're interested in some quick terminology, if I can't find what I have because it's unavailable, then therefore I have demand. So in the presence of the absence of an item, I really need eggs. And I've come to the marketplace with a lot of stuff, but you don't have eggs, and 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 we can't do business because I want eggs. So that means I have a demand for something. I have a need, a demand for something. And you can't supply it. And so one of the real problems was, if we all lived in the same region, it was likely, Lizzie, Elizabeth, it was likely, Lizzie, we were all growing the same thing. So you can travel across the US and you can find certain crops grow real well in Florida. What grows real well in Florida? Oranges. Do they grow in Minnesota? No. But everybody that lives in Florida probably grows oranges, tangerines, clementines. What else? Grapefruit? Yes, Connor. Anything else? Figs? Yeah. And there's probably things they don't grow real well in Florida. So you don't see major crop like corn and soybean and wheat and hay and clover and some of that, where that's grown largely in the Midwest. Different soils, different cultures. So why would I show up to the market and not find it? Because we all live right here. Remember, they didn't have the transportation you and I had. So if they came to the marketplace in Nazareth, those people probably lived 20 or 30 or 40 miles within Nazareth or Bethlehem, and that's where they went to do business. Well, likelihood is they all were fig farmers and they were all orange farmers and they all had the same stuff. So it created demands, and that's where we get this supply-demand coming out of that, is that people have needs, people have wants. And those smaller marketplace didn't have a lot of variability or variety, couldn't supply my needs. I had stuff I had to trade, but you didn't have what I wanted. I couldn't find it. Or, as I just equally mentioned, we all had the same thing. You got fish, I got fish, you got corn, I got corn. You got soy, I got soy. And it wouldn't do us any good. If I came with dollars to buy stuff and all Nolan had was dollars, he had dollars, I had dollars, we both have an ability to buy, we both have some commerce availability to buy stuff, but we didn't have what each other needed. And so we had the same thing, it wouldn't do us any good. So another downside to just a general bartering system is that the same things kept showing up too often. And the specific things we needed were a little harder to find. Now that's interesting, because that'll lead into supply issues. Supply chain issues create demand. Demand increases price. Price increases inflation. Inflation can be good for the organization and bad for the consumer. So we're actually going to get more into economics. If you spent any time with Dr. Boulay or Mr. Entrican in either his sport economics or his macro class, you might have drawn some of these concepts out, and you might even hear some accounting one stuff, some appreciation and depreciation, maybe surplus and deficit. I'll intertwine some of those because those are all financially related as we go forward. You may not hear them all today, but they'll come out over the next few weeks. Another problem was this very supply-demand issue, and so it creates this wonderful chasm known as scarcity. When one item that I really want, or two items, and neither one of us have it, maybe we both have an abundance of dollars or corn or cows or chickens, but whatever I want or whatever you want, there's limited supply of it. We call that scarcity. Now that is a term we're going to use a lot. It is applied in a financial setting, and when we have limited resources, that could be energy, that could be money, that could be cash reserves. When I have limited cognitive resources, when I have limited labor, that's people, then I have a scarcity and I have great demand. So we're going to talk about that. But if you're not familiar, simply you can circle or highlight that word and say, you know what, scarcity is something Dr. Briggs is going to talk about. Now it's interesting, on other screens the red shows up real well, and then in smaller TVs it may not show up as well. Of course, my eyes, as I hit the age of 50, yes, that's what it is. My eyes have been playing tricks on me, so I've had to wear these things a little more than I'm accustomed to. So I tend to put them down. I shouldn't do that. Problems with bartering. And this is one that was probably the most difficult as bartering evolved and advanced. We began to see that there was an inequitable value occurring at a transaction. There was an absence of equal value. I'll take a little bit of time to kind of spell this one out for you. But we might be forced from time to time to exchange things. I might be forced to give up more value and get something that has less value. Now you say, well, how is that so? Well, back in the old days, if I brought a block of gold or a block of salt, or if I had a cow that weighed 400 pounds, I can't really subdivide gold. It's not that easy to cut it with a saw or salt. I can't really cut the cow up into quarters like a butcher can today. It wasn't easy to do that back then. So I would either have to sell you the entire cow or trade you the entire block of salt or block of gold. And if all I needed was 6 dozen eggs and you threw in a few chickens, I would still lose on that exchange from a value perspective. I would get what I want, but unfortunately sometimes I really had to give up too much because there wasn't ways to subdivide. Now we've solved that. The $1 bill, the $100 bill can be subdivided in 100 ones, or 5 20s, or 10 10s, or 25. So we can subdivide larger amounts of money down into smaller. But you couldn't do that in a bartering system. It wasn't as easy. Now you could measure the weight of corn, a bushel, or a peck of corn, grain, or things like that. But there were some items that weren't able to be subdivided down, and you would lose on the value, but you needed to make that trade. And that was unfortunate. So there's a loss of value that occurs when you can't subdivide stuff down very easily. So however, we have seen the advances through the Roman era, where they began to really print and mint coinages. And I've got some widow's mites and some Roman coins I'll bring in, some drachma, and show you what the real stuff looks like. But the advances of Roman finance, Roman monetary system enabled us to begin to move from just bartering to bartering using items of monetary value. So the Romans were some of the first culture to be able to make silver and gold coins after the likeness of the Caesars. For example, as a way to honor the king, each new Caesar came in and they would print, they actually would hand stamp it, they'd have a stamp and they'd have to pound it, make coinage in their likeness. It was a way for them to kind of ruminate over their affluence and influence, but it was used in society. And so coins of gold and silver were made. People knew that gold and silver had tremendous value, so they could then be exchanged into the systems of life to buy and sell things. There was still bartering going on, but bartering item for item or bartering an item for gold or silver began to evolve in the Roman culture. So in some regards, we could thank the Romans for the advances that we see in our monetary system today and our ability to exchange money in the marketplace to buy things. So your consumer purchases, your retail purchases, your residential and commercial purchases can be somewhat accredited back to the monetary system that the Romans helped establish. And out of that, then, we were able to find much more equitable trade values. So I could then take a few coins and give it a little more of an exactness of value. So when I bought eggs from you, or wood, let's say lumber to build my house, or brick and mortar back then when they built a house, I was able to pay subcontractors a little bit more of an exact value rather than just giving up the entire cow. And that's where that phrase came from. You never want to give up the entire cow or give up the house for something you need. That means you're overpaying or you're over bartering for something, but that's only because it couldn't be subdivided. Well, heading into a monetary system when the Romans began to really take over, during Jesus' time, you can see Roman culture and Roman influence. And the Roman monetary system began to really kind of take over in Near Eastern culture, and then you see this kind of ability for people in the marketplace to make a little more equitable transactions. Equitable meaning there's equal value, equal trades. And so you didn't have to lose your shirt, another phrase that came out of a trade. So then that leads us to understanding some general characteristics of money. And once we understand the characteristics, then we can apply them and we can make understanding of them as we go forward. But general characteristics of money, well, they come in different shapes and sizes and colors. Probably over the next couple of days, I'll bring in some world currencies and show you. I've collected currencies from all over the world. I used to travel around the world, and every country I would visit, I would get paper dollars, or paper bills, I should say, and coinage and bring them back. We'll show some of that off and talk about it. So money almost from salt to gold is a really good medium of exchange. So a characteristic of money is that it's well accepted. It is a good medium for us to exchange and do business. And so as business professionals, what do we want to do in the marketplace? We want to run our sport businesses so that we do business. And to do business, we have to make exchanges in the marketplace. Money is the best. Right now, money and digital credit are the best, or digital exchanges are the best ways to actually conduct business. Governments generally store and reserve money, and then out of that, for centuries, they've printed fiat currency for the longest time. For the longest time, up until the early 1970s, the governments around the world would store gold and silver, platinum, and palladium, and then they would have an assigned value to those, and then they would be able to print their own money against the value of that. So if a country, let me just take a country like Canada, had $20 billion in gold, they could print no more than, or have in circulation no more than $20 billion worth of Canadian money. So the Canadian money that's circulated in the society should be equated back to the assets of the government, because the currency would be issued by the government. So we did that all the way up to the 1970s, and then we came off the gold standard, and that's when money printing went haywire, particularly here in the West for the United States, because we are the world's reserve currency. Now that's something else I need to talk about. I can't do that today, but because of that, it gave us a privilege to print unlimited amounts of money, and other countries didn't have that privilege. But I'll come back to that on another day. Characteristics of money. Probably one of the more significant characteristics that we have seen and used advantageously is that it's divisible. We can divide it down into smaller units and smaller measurements. And so, if you pull out a 20, and then you have a 10, then you have a 5, you got some ones, well, that's the divisibility of these pieces of paper. They have different values. Some are larger, some are smaller, but you can bring large sums, you can use small sums, and I don't have to lose in the transaction or lose in the value of that. Gold and silver isn't as easily divisible, so they would have to stamp it into coinage, and then they would say it had value. If you look at some of the early coins from the pre-1933 in America, going all the way back into several hundred years ago, you could see they would have the $5 eagle, the 2.5 eagle, the 20 and the 50. Those would be the four divisions when they made gold coins here in America, and we actually got that from another society, that unit of measure. But one of the greatest things is it allows us to zero down right to the penny exactly what the transaction cost is, and then I don't ever have to overpay. I can actually give you that amount right down to $7.31. I can give you that 31 cents, and I don't lose even a penny in the transactability. So the monetary system's divisibility into smaller numerable quantities or values have allowed us to really equalize the transactions. That's important to us. Second really probably most prominent aspect of a monetary system is that I can transport it anywhere, and it's real easy. It's not easy to take cows and houses and lumps of salt and gold, bags of money. If all I had was $1 bills and I went to buy a house for $300,000, I'd have to box up 300,000 $1 bills and take it to the bank. Well, that's just not feasible. So the portability, the ability to carry it, now this is all pre-electronic assets and electronic transactions, but our ability to transport, the portability of the money, the monetary system really makes it valuable. I can go from place to place, state to state, and even country to country. So now it opens the doors to international trade, international business, intrastate, across the state lines, or or intra within the state line. So all those things can be done now because the monetary system allows us to do that. Otherwise, we'd have to load up our car full of stuff and go to North Carolina and make trades, and go to Tennessee and make trades, go to West Virginia, Virginia, and make trades. Well, that's just not feasible anymore. That's just, it wasn't 30 years ago, 50 years ago, so the portability really made it more convenient for people to do business, and we were able to build businesses out of that. I mean, just imagine if you had to take a block of salt or several blocks of salt somewhere and try to make trades. You'd be hauling all kinds of commodities, and it just would make it real difficult to measure, it would make it real difficult to subdivide it, make it real difficult to transport stuff. Well, being able to have subdivided monies into smaller bills, forever we carried smaller bills. Now we're moving into more credit-based society and digital currencies, digital finance, so even that is changing in amongst our midst. If you ever watch The Three Stooges, it's a great, they have a great short, which is so identified here, but in this particular episode, they are ICE delivery men, and they pull up at this house, and to the side here would have been their ICE wagon, would have been pulled either by a couple of horses, or maybe it was automated, and they get out and they open the bag at the back, and the block of ice was about that size, and they would have the clamps, and you can see that's how they did it in the old days. They would, this is before refrigerators and ice makers in the 1920s, 1930s, 1880s. They used to have, just like milkmen delivered milk, they would have ice men deliver ice, and we would store that every couple of days. It would melt down, people would use it. So now what's comical about this is they get there, Curly, I think that's Curly, gets the block of ice. He goes rushing up the stairs, and then he looks up and sees it's about 2 miles worth of stairs. It goes forever. And so he kind of hustles along. By the time he gets to the top, what do you think has happened? The ice has shrunk down. It's a cube about that size. And he gets frustrated, and he does his, and he goes back down, he gets another one. It happens about 2 times, and they can't figure it out. It's a classic application of there's some things that aren't very portable. It lost its value. It started, it was worth X. By the time he got to the top of the stairs, it became Y, and it lost its value, and he knew he couldn't go to the door because they bought this, or she was going to buy this, and he only had that to deliver. So the portability was interrupted by the climate and the environment. And that's classic. But that is truthfully representative of why why the monetary system is great for portability. Number 3, one of the great assets of the monetary system is it's not easily duplicated or duplicable. And so money must not be easily copied or defrauded, fraudulented. It must not be easily counterfeited would be a good word. If it were easy for you and I to reproduce it, we'd all do it. And if we all did it, then we all had it. Now let's stop right there and make some assessments about that. If money grew on a tree, and I could sell each one of you a money tree, Nolan would have one, and Jake would have one, and Jesse would have one, and so it would grow these fancy $20 bills on them, and they could have plenty of 20s. But if I could sell everyone a money tree and everybody had lots of 20s, what kind of value would these really possess?
None.
Why?
Because everybody has it.
Yes, when everybody has the same thing and it's that easily obtainable,
It means nothing.
that it has no value at all. That's exactly right. Douglas, right? Yeah, great call on it, man, thank you. Yeah, so when all of us can easily reproduce something without working for it, if you can't invest blood, sweat, and guts, and it's just a phrase, if you can't invest time, money, energy, and labor to acquire this, if you can't work hard for this, it doesn't really make this valuable.
Mm-hmm.
So stealing it doesn't make it valuable. Counterfeiting it doesn't make it valuable. Growing this doesn't make it valuable. In fact, it devalues what everybody else has. So not only does it not make it valuable for you, it actually devalues. If all of us had a printing press and you could print $1 million and you wanted to buy my house and each one of you walked up with $1 million, I wouldn't sell you the house for the million, I'd have to make the price 20 million or 50 million or 100 million. And so what happens is this devalues when there's too much of it. But when there's scarcity, what does scarcity do? When there's limited supply, this does what in value?
Goes up.
Yeah. So when there's scarcity in any asset in this world, you automatically know the value goes up. And when there's an overabundance of supply and everybody's got it, then the real value declines. There you go. So now we're learning finance. And you're gonna be able to apply that kind of learning, that's good. But if money was duplicable, it would be no good. So it must be designed and produced by governments in such a way that it's not reproducible, it can't be defrauded or counterfeited. So because of that, in the bills, we have all these special bars, and they use special paper, the governments take precautions with the strips in them, and they're redesigning things, they got numbers on them. What they do is they pull dirty and torn money out of circulation, and they put new money into circulation, so the Treasury's constantly doing those kind of things to be able to make sure that the best quality paper is available in the marketplace. Now, they do some other things that I don't necessarily prefer, and we can talk about quantitative easing and all the printing they've done, but that's for a little bit later. There was a movie, Leonardo DiCaprio made a movie, probably 15, 20 years ago, and I think it was called Catch Me If You Can. Does anybody remember that movie?
Yeah.
The premise of that movie was that he was counterfeiting checks early on, somewhere in the 1960s, when checks were very new to people in society. He was a smart guy, figured out a way to counterfeit numbers and bank accounts, and he counterfeited a lot of things. I think he got his pilot's license and worked for an international air company, and was bouncing around the world and counterfeiting checks and accruing assets that were by defrauding others, particularly banks and people. Eventually, Tom Hanks and the FBI caught up with him, and they arrested him, and he knew it would eventually come. And then, after his sentencing and a few years in the penal system, he was given an opportunity to assist the FBI, and I think he went to work as part of his remediation. He went to work for the FBI in their counterfeit division to then help them solve counterfeit crimes. He was so good at it, he was like the best or whatever. And so then he became a consultant or maybe an employee, I'm not quite sure, but that's based on a true story, I understand that. But boy, if you watch that movie, you can see why it's important that we can't duplicate assets because of what they do, the defrauding of others, the stealing of others. See, every time he cashed a check at a bank, he was defrauding whoever the bank was, or the check was written against. And so, who puts money in banks? People do. So where do banks get money? Well, we put our assets there. And every time somebody goes and steals it, like he did in that movie, whose money is he really stealing? Ours. Does that make you happy or upset? Okay, so every time somebody defrauds a bank, they're really defrauding who? All of us. So just be aware of that. Yeah. So that's a good movie. You may want to catch that, and again, and then you can see the application here. Let me see. I think this might be the last one or second to last one. A key characteristics or core value elements of a healthy monetary system is that our money would be or should be a good store of value, in that this has value from day to day, and I can go into the marketplace yesterday and today and tomorrow, and then there is some level of value that I can rely that this 2-0 on here is going to be good tomorrow and today and yesterday, and they're all going to be the same. It has to be able to store its value over periods of time in order for me to put trust and faith and confidence in this. Otherwise, I don't have confidence in this. If it doesn't store value, this falls apart and society crumbles. Now, we can talk about some things that are going on in the more modern era. I'm very up to date with electronic finances and bitcoins and electronic currencies, and I invest in all kinds of things. We'll get to some of those things, but right now, let's just establish the fact that if I can't trust this, if you can't trust this, if this doesn't store its value, if you put 5 of these in the bank, which is $100, and you go back 2 weeks later and you draw it out, you would hope that you could draw out $100, and it's worth $100 in the marketplace. It would be terrible if you put 5 of these in the bank at 100, and you went back 2 weeks later and it devalued and the bank only gave you 90. That would be terrible. If it didn't store its value, you wouldn't use this anymore. You would get as far away from it as possible. So we have to have faith and confidence in the system that it stores its value, and it does it for over periods of time. In fact, the truth is, I should be able to put it in the bank and for years and years and years. As long as the government assures that this country stays afloat and things are good, then my money, the monetary system within this society, I should be able to put money in savings, and it maintains its value. Now, I'm growing it, I'm accruing the value by adding more to it, that's a different matter, but I should be able to take it out in 5 or 10 years and still have the same value. If it doesn't, it's a bad store of money. Now, let me stop right there, and that would be our first introduction. Before I move into the next thing, is there any questions about the basic notion of bartering and just some key characteristics or elements of a good monetary system, a good system? Okay, well, let's challenge ourselves for a minute. So, if all I had was 50s and 100s, if all you had was 50s and 100s, what would be the problem in doing business in the marketplace? I would be overpaying for everything, and therefore it would be an inequitable trade. You would give me the 50s, a $50 bill, and even though the transaction was a $20 transaction, I got to keep 50, I gave you whatever you were buying for 20, I gained, you lost. I had more surplus, you had more deficit from it. So yeah, so that would be one example of that. If this ever loses its value, then what happens to us transacting business in society if it ever loses value?
Everything will go up if we just have 50s and 100s.
Yeah, so if this loses value, although this says 20, it says 20. If it only buys for me $10 of product, if it only buys 10, it is deflated in value, then I actually have to spend more of these to get what I want. That's called inflation. But your employer is only gonna pay you whatever the negotiated rate is. So let's say you earn $1,000 a week, so that's $4,000 a month, even though there's 4.3 weeks in a month. Let's just say if you earn $1,000 a week for 4 weeks and you earn $4,000 a month, but your rent goes up because of inflation, your employer just doesn't pay you more because there's inflation in society. So when there's inflation, when this goes down and the cost of goods goes up and your income stays the same, what happens is you lose ground in the equation. So even though you're bringing home $4,000, it might only buy you $3,000 worth of stuff, or $2,000, whatever the percentage of decline is. And so there is a wonderful, it's not so wonderful, it's a great example. We'll get to it in about a week when I talk about inflation, or maybe it's a couple weeks. I have an article and a story and a picture, but a shopping cart in a grocery store in the 1970s was filled, and for one $20 bill, you could fill the entire shopping cart full of goods. It was unbelievable. Eggs, milk, meat, butter, and stuff. I mean, it's a shopping cart full for one $20 bill. And then in 2019, to go to a grocery store, what can you buy with $20? There were 4 items in there. And to look at the gross deficit of the difference there is just astonishing. It's really eye-opening. So I'm going to bring that to you. There'll be a point in time when we talk about inflation. But that's when you start to see, oh my goodness, I may be making that $1,000 a week or $4,000 a month, but if the currency is deflating, and if the cost of goods are inflating, and if they're giving me less product, that's called shrinkflation. You know, in the old days, you'd buy a box of cereal, and you'd open the box, and the entire plastic bag would be full. I remember as a kid, probably your age, open the bag, and if you opened it too hard, the cereal would go flying out, because they would fill that plastic bag all the way to the top. Now when you go to the grocery store, the boxes are bigger. The plastic bag is only, half filled? and the rest of it's filled with air. Now, that's called shrinkflation, where they shrink the quality of it, they make the packaging a little bit bigger, so you think you're getting more. That's psychological. So they make you think you're getting more, and then they fill the bag with air at the top part to make it weigh a little more and to make you feel like you're getting more. But it's really, they've shrunk the quantity, the amount of stuff in the product. And again, that's all a form of deflation, and they've raised their price a little bit, and inflation. So the cost of the good inflates, the quantity of the good deflates, and the amount of good they're giving you shrinkflates all at the same time. And all that is designed to squeeze more money out of you so the corporations can maybe have more money. Now, sometimes they're being squeezed down the supply chain, so it's not all greed, but sometimes it is greed. So we'll talk about greed-based economies or demand-pulled economies where the supply chain affects us. Any questions about any of that? I do want to do just a couple of terms, and you can stop the recording now. Let me just get